The smell of ozone and wet concrete clung to the air, a scent that always signaled the arrival of a storm in this desolate corner of the state. 10 years ago, that same sharp metallic tang marked the night the farmhouse burned to the ground. The night everything in my life fractured. I stood in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor of the Blackwood Maximum Security Penitentiary, my nursing badge feeling heavy and cold against my chest. I had spent a decade running from the truth, burying the memory of that fire under layers of professional duty and clinical detachment. I believed the past was dead, interred alongside the man I helped send away. But as I walked toward the isolation block, the heavy steel door creaked open to reveal a face I prayed I would never encounter again. Elias Thorne was not supposed to be the man haunting my peripheral vision in these quiet, late-night shifts. I looked at the intake files, and the inconsistency in the records hit me like a physical blow. The timestamps on his original conviction didn't align with the fire department's log. My name is the storyteller behind Swasti Diaries, and this is the anatomy of a decade-long lie that was never meant to be uncovered. Looking back, I realized the arson was never about destruction. It was a calculated shroud for something far more valuable, and I was the one who inadvertently held the match. The silence of the prison at 3 a.m. was not peaceful. It was a warning that the secrets I left in the ashes were finally catching up to me. I moved to this town specifically for its anonymity, believing that if I buried myself in the sterile, high-walled routine of Blackwood, the ghost of that farmhouse would finally stop following me. I thought the prison was a sanctuary of order, a place where every action was logged and every movement accounted for by steel and concrete. I was wrong. The air inside Blackwood was never truly still. It carried the faint, metallic scent of ozone, a sensory echo that triggered my worst memories of that night 10 years ago. My life became a series of quiet, late-night shifts, walking through corridors where the silence felt like a held breath waiting to snap. I treated my patients with a clinical distance, a barrier I built to keep the truth from leaking into my current existence. But the ledger of my past was never balanced. When I looked at the intake files that night, I realized the prison was not an escape, it was a trap. The timestamps, the falsified logs, and the cold, unyielding reality of the records suggested that someone within these walls had been orchestrating my path for years. Every door I unlocked, every heavy key I turned, only pulled me deeper into a sequence of events I had tried to outrun. The central absence in my life was not just the man I condemned. It was the truth of what actually burned in that fire. I was a nurse who lived by the clock, yet I had no idea that time had been manipulated against me from the very beginning. The farmhouse did not burn with the chaotic fury of an accident. It consumed itself with a terrifying, calculated precision. I remembered standing on the damp grass, watching the rafters groan under the weight of an orange glow that felt more like a signal than a disaster. The air smelled of gasoline and old, dry timber, a scent that lingered in my lungs for weeks. I had testified that Elias Thorne was seen fleeing the property, his silhouette framed against the encroaching inferno. But looking back, the timeline never held water. The fire started in the basement, yet the back door was bolted from the inside. How could he have exited the rear if the locks were engaged by a deadbolt that required a key from the kitchen? I had ignored the contradiction then, blinded by my own proximity to the event and the pressure to find a villain. The charred silver locket I found in the rubble later that morning, the one piece of jewelry my mother never took off, was not in the bedroom where she slept. It was discovered in the locked study, miles away from the primary point of ignition. This was the first true crack in the foundation of my memory. If Elias was the perpetrator, why would he be looting the study while the basement turned into a furnace? And if he was innocent, who had the keys to the study, the gasoline, and the motive to erase the history of that house? The silence of the evidence was louder than the screams I had tried to bury. The medical wing of the infirmary at night felt like a tomb, cold and smelling of industrial bleach. I was cataloging the evening shift medications when I found them, 3 folded scraps of paper tucked beneath the edge of the heavy steel-topped desk. They were not official records. The handwriting was jagged, frantic, and unmistakably familiar. Each note contained a single, cryptic instruction leading toward the solitary cells in the lower block. As I traced the loops of the letters, my pulse quickened. These were the same flourishes I had seen 1,000 times in the journals of a boy I once trusted as my closest friend. My mind raced back to our childhood, to the way he used to press his pen into the paper until the nib nearly tore the sheet. If he were truly gone, as the records claimed, how did these notes materialize in a secure wing? The inconsistency was suffocating. I realized then that the fire had not just consumed a farmhouse, it had burned a path through the truth of my own history. I moved toward the restricted corridor, my flashlight beam cutting through the stagnant air. Every step felt like a betrayal of the life I had built to forget. I reached the service door, noticing that the electronic lock had been bypassed with a simple manual override pin, a tool only a seasoned guard would possess. This was no longer a mystery about a lost inmate or a tragic accident. It was a calculated, ongoing deception. Someone was feeding me these breadcrumbs, and I was walking straight into a trap, yet I could not stop. The question that clawed at me was no longer who started the fire, but who stood to gain the most from keeping the embers alive. The handwriting on the scraps was not the frantic scrawl of a desperate inmate, but the practiced clinical cursive of an administrator. I stopped in the middle of the corridor, the realization striking harder than a physical blow. If these notes were planted, then the trail did not lead to salvation, but to a curated history. I examined the ink under the flicker of the overhead light. It was a distinctive archival blue, the same shade used by the guard station logs. My heart tightened. I had spent a decade fearing the man who supposedly started the fire, yet the evidence now suggested he was merely a placeholder. The service door remained slightly ajar, a silent invitation into the restricted zone. I looked down at the floor, noting the scuff marks on the linoleum. They were too uniform, too deliberate, pointing directly toward the ventilation shaft. It was not a path of flight, but a path of concealment. I had been manipulated into believing that my own memories were the enemy, while the true mastermind sat in the guard tower, watching me trace shadows. Every interaction I had endured in this prison, every late-night shift and whispered warning, now carried the weight of a calculated deception. I turned toward the lower block, the air growing colder with every step. The question was no longer about the fire's origin, but why a guard would risk his career to keep a decade-old lie from unraveling. I had to know what was buried beneath the floorboards of the solitary wing. The ventilation shaft did not lead to an exit, but to a maintenance junction that connected the warden's private office to the isolation block. I knelt in the dust, tracing the edges of a metal grate that had been unscrewed with surgical precision. This was no inmate's desperate gamble. It was a well-oiled machine, maintained by someone with unrestricted access to the facility's deepest arteries. My thoughts drifted to Nurse Elena, whose quiet diligence had always felt like a shield, yet now appeared as a surveillance mechanism. She had been the one to insist on my medication protocols during the weeks leading up to the fire. Was it care, or was it a method to ensure I remained disoriented while the records were scrubbed? The web of complicity tightened. If Marcus Vane, the head guard, had orchestrated the theft of the land deeds, he required a scapegoat with a history of instability. My own trauma, a lapse in judgment I had buried beneath a decade of penance, was the perfect foundation for his lie. I examined the floorboards once more, finding a small metallic fragment caught in a splintered edge. It was a brass key tag, stamped with the maintenance serial that corresponded to the guard tower. The motive was not simply a land deal. It was the preservation of a hierarchy built on the ruins of innocent lives. I stood up, the silence of the corridor pressing against me like a physical weight. I had found the path, but the realization that my own past had been weaponized to serve Vane's ambition made me wonder if I was meant to discover this truth, or if I was simply stepping deeper into another trap. The brass key tag was merely the beginning of a much larger deception. As I pushed further into the maintenance junction, the air grew stagnant, heavy with the scent of ozone and wet concrete. Behind a loose panel I found it, the charred silver locket. It was tucked away in a recess that only someone with intimate knowledge of the prison's structural blueprints could have accessed. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the soot-stained metal. This was not a random piece of debris. The locket belonged to my mother, lost in a house fire long before I ever set foot in this facility. Seeing it here in the cold, dark heart of a prison confirmed the impossible. My life had been monitored and orchestrated by Marcus Vane for years before I signed my contract. He had not just framed an inmate. He had curated my trauma to ensure I would be the perfect, malleable nurse. The inconsistency was glaring. If the locket was in the prison, it meant the fire that destroyed my family home was likely connected to the same land deeds Vane had stolen. The arson wasn't a sudden act of violence. It was a long-game execution. I stared at the charred silver, realizing that my entire career was built on a foundation of manufactured grief. The silence of the tunnel was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of a decade's worth of lies. If Vane possessed my past, he had also dictated my future. I needed to know how he had acquired the locket without leaving a trace of his own presence in my history. The investigation had shifted from a prison mystery to a personal vendetta. The discovery of the locket shifted the reality of my past. As I cleaned the soot from the silver engraving, the initials did not match my mother's name. They belonged to Vane's own family vault, a detail I had overlooked in my grief. The arson was never about destroying my history. It was a targeted removal of a witness who knew the truth about the stolen land deeds. I realized then that Elias Thorne was never the perpetrator. He was the only person who possessed the original unredacted records that proved the warden's innocence. Vane had kept him imprisoned, not for the fire, but to ensure those documents never surfaced. The pattern became clear. Vane manipulated my trauma to keep me compliant and isolated within the prison walls, using my nursing role to monitor anyone who came close to the truth. My entire career was a tactical placement, a cage built from my own manufactured sorrow. Every interaction I had with Vane now felt like a calculated checkmate. I looked at the locket, then at the maintenance tunnel leading toward the administrative wing. The silence of the prison felt like a ticking clock. I had to find the records, but I now understood that the person I trusted to guide my investigation had been the one pulling the strings from the very beginning. The evidence was no longer just in the past. It was currently hidden in Vane's own office, waiting for the one person he thought he had perfectly broken. The deeper I dug into the town's archives, the more the prison walls felt like a facade for a much larger operation. It was never about justice or rehabilitation. The fire that consumed the records a decade ago was a calculated act, a strategic erasure of land titles that allowed Vane and his associates to seize prime real estate under the guise of municipal redevelopment. I traced the insurance payouts back to a shell company registered to the very warden who had signed my employment contract. The prison was not merely a penitentiary. It was a secure repository for the town's most dangerous secrets, a place where people were discarded to ensure they could never testify against the architects of this theft. Elias Thorne had stumbled upon these files while working in the archives, and his silence was bought with a life sentence. Every time I had been told to monitor him, I was actually being used to ensure he remained isolated from any legal counsel who might have reopened the case. The realization chilled me. I was not a nurse in a prison. I was a pawn in a long-standing conspiracy. The locket I found was not a memento. It was a key, a physical piece of evidence that linked the arsonist directly to the administrative wing. The silence in the office was absolute, broken only by the hum of the cooling fan above the desk. I stood amidst the scattered files, the weight of the conspiracy finally pressing down. If Vane returned, he would know I had breached the inner sanctum. I had to move before the pre-dawn shift arrived to secure the perimeter. I held the ledger against my chest, the weight of the ink-stained pages providing a false sense of security. For weeks, I convinced myself that Warden Miller was the architect of the arson. The financial records appeared to confirm it. A series of suspicious offshore transfers aligned perfectly with the dates of the land seizures. I felt a surge of grim satisfaction as I traced the trail to his private accounts. I believed I had solved the decade-old mystery. I was ready to bring the evidence to the light. Then I turned to the final page of the internal audit. A small, overlooked entry caught my eye. A bank reconciliation dated 48 hours before the fire. The funds were not being funneled into the warden's pockets. They were being returned to the state treasury under a redacted code. My theory collapsed in an instant. The warden was not stealing the land. He was being blackmailed by someone who knew his own dark secrets. The arson was not an act of corporate greed, but a desperate, violent distraction to burn the evidence of that blackmail. I looked at the desk, the silence of the room suddenly feeling like an interrogation. If the warden was merely a puppet, then the real mastermind was still watching from the shadows of the staff quarters. I realized with a sickening jolt that the locket I found in the archive was not stolen from the warden. It was a gift, inscribed with the name I had seen on every single shift schedule for the past 10 years. The fire was never about the money. It was about protecting a legacy. The discovery of the redacted code shifted my entire perspective. I realized then that the audit was never the key to the warden's corruption, but a map leading directly to the person who controlled the flow of information. I looked at the shift schedule again, focusing on the night of the fire. One name appeared consistently in the logs for every section where the security cameras had malfunctioned: Marcus Vane. He was not just the head guard. He was the ghost in the machine. I found a loose floorboard beneath the administrative desk, and tucked inside, I discovered a small leather-bound notebook. It contained precise timestamps that contradicted his official reports. He claimed to be patrolling the perimeter, yet the logs placed him inside the records room precisely when the fire started. The logic was cold and undeniable. Vane did not start the fire to destroy the building. He started it to destroy the original land deeds that proved he had been extorting the local landowners for years. Elias Thorne was not the arsonist. He was simply the unfortunate witness who saw Vane ignite the accelerant. By framing Elias, Vane ensured that the only person who could testify against him would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The weight of the injustice hit me with a force that made the room feel suddenly smaller. I held the notebook in my hands, the ink fading but the intent clear. Vane had built his entire career on a foundation of ash and lies. Now I had the proof to dismantle it. The question remained: if I brought this to the surface, would I be the next piece of evidence he chose to burn? The timeline settled into place like a jagged puzzle. Vane had not acted on impulse. He had orchestrated a surgical strike. By reviewing the shift logs against the physical damage in the records room, I saw the sequence unfold. He entered the East Wing at 11:42 p.m., timing his movement to the exact blind spot of the security array. He carried the accelerant in a standard-issue cleaning bucket, a detail so mundane it escaped notice during the initial investigation. He ignited the deeds, then retreated through the ventilation maintenance hatch, locking it behind him to create the illusion of a sealed room. The fire was a calculated destruction of evidence, designed to frame Elias, who was merely in the wrong place at the wrong time. Elias witnessed the ignition. He saw Vane's face illuminated by the sudden flare of the synthetic liquid. Vane knew the inmate could never be believed, so he ensured the silence was permanent by burying him under a mountain of fabricated arson charges. Every step I took now felt like I was walking through Vane's shadow. The notebook in my hand was the only thing that didn't fit his narrative. It was a ledger of his own arrogance. I realized then that my arrival at this facility was not a coincidence. I was a variable he had failed to account for, a nurse with a past he thought he could manipulate using the same fear he used on Elias. The silence of the prison felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves were watching to see if I would become the next casualty of his desperate, burning secret. The ledger held the final, impossible contradiction. I traced the entries for the night of the fire, noting the discrepancy between the guard station logs and the physical timestamps on the ventilation hatch. Elias had not been the one to trigger the alarm. He had been the one to silence it. My hands trembled as I realized the true motive behind his silence. He possessed the land deed, the very document Vane had tried to incinerate. The inmate I feared was the only person who had been trying to protect the facility's archives from the corruption rotting it from the inside out. I looked at the charred locket again, its metal casing twisted in a way that suggested it had been dropped in haste, not placed as a trophy. Vane had not framed Elias for the fire. He had framed him to hide the theft of the deeds, using the fire as a convenient shroud for his own financial gain. The logic was cold, precise, and devastatingly simple. Every fear I harbored, every suspicion I directed toward Elias, had been the product of Vane's careful psychological engineering. The roles of victim and villain had inverted in my mind. Elias was not a prisoner of his own guilt, but a prisoner of his own integrity, trapped by a secret that could have exonerated him years ago. Now the silence of the prison felt less like a threat and more like a confession, waiting for the truth to be unearthed from the ashes of a lie. The truth did not arrive in a flash of realization, but in the grinding halt of a mechanical gear. Standing in the guard station, I looked at the master key ring Vane had left on the desk, a careless oversight born of absolute arrogance. The logs I recovered from the secondary server proved he had manually overridden the fire suppression system minutes before the first smoke detector triggered. He had not been fighting the blaze. He had been curating it. The silver locket, which I once viewed as a tragic memento, was actually the key to his undoing. It contained a micro SD card, a primitive, desperate backup Elias had hidden inside the casing, knowing the digital archives were compromised. I inserted the card into the console, and the flickering monitor revealed the footage of the night in question. Vane was not in the control room as he claimed. He was in the records vault, transferring the deeds into his own briefcase. Elias had seen him. The struggle that followed was not a murder attempt, but a frantic attempt by Elias to secure the evidence. Vane had simply used the fire as a shroud to destroy the witness and the proof simultaneously. My hands remained steady as I printed the final log. The psychological cage Vane built around me, the constant reminders of my mistakes and the fabricated guilt, had been a masterclass in deflection. I had been the perfect instrument for his deception because I was too afraid to look at my own reflection. Now the silence of the prison was no longer a threat. It was a witness. Vane was currently on his final rounds, unaware that the evidence he assumed was ash had finally found its way into the light of the console. The sirens that finally tore through the prison yard were not a sound of chaos, but of closure. As the authorities moved in, I watched from the periphery of the guard station, my own role in this tragedy finally stripped of its pretenses. Vane was escorted out in silence, his power rendered as hollow as the lies he had built around Elias. The records I provided were insurmountable. The land deeds, the falsified fire logs, and the evidence of his calculated sabotage left no room for his usual deflection. Elias was released, though the years stolen from him could never be returned to the ledger of his life. Looking at the empty, sterile walls of the facility, I realized that my own silence had been the final brick in the prison he constructed. I was not just a nurse. I was a witness who had finally chosen to see. The silver locket, once a burden of hidden truth, now sat on the evidence table, its micro SD card having served its purpose in dismantling an empire of greed. I walked away from the perimeter, the night air finally feeling thin and clean. The mystery was solved, yet the cost remained etched into the architecture of my memory. Some secrets are never buried. They are merely waiting for the light to expose their decay. Thank you for walking through this dark corridor with me. If you enjoyed this journey into the shadows of the truth, please subscribe to Swasti Diaries.